I wear a number of hats. I come from a mixed family farm. We've been farming for multiple generations, and we're just at a stage now of transferring the management, I suppose, between my father and myself. So we're sort of going through one of these things that has to happen on farms every generation, and that's the sort of transfer of control. And we're sort of doing that gently as we go. But my father is still very much involved. So I'm just going to run through a bit of an introduction to the farm to give you some context, and then we'll look at what happens in a typical arable farming year. We have sheep as well, so we'll have a little bit of a look at what we do with those through the year, and then we'll move on to looking at the sustainable practices that we can implement and their importance. Now, farming is an extremely nuanced business. There are many different types. I'm going to concentrate mostly on arable because that's what we do. But there's horticulture, of course, the growing of vegetables. There's fruit growing, viticulture, and dairy and livestock. So we have a massive variety in this country, as well as across the world. But many of the techniques we're going to talk about in the sustainability element of this are applicable to that sort of broad range of activities. The other thing it's worth noting is that although we have 35 minutes to talk about this and then some questions afterwards, we are very limited because farming is an extremely diverse operation. And I've just been on a course about sustainable land management, which took 4 days, and that wasn't nearly enough. So we're talking about a very complicated subject here. Anyway, if we could have the next slide, please. So this is a map of the area that we largely used to farm back in the mid 1800s. We were tenant farmers, and this estate was owned by Squire Young of Allingbury. Northamptonshire is known as the Spires and the Squires for the number of churches it has with spires and the enormous number of large country houses and estates that there were once upon a time. And we rented a considerable proportion of that land that you see there. Now, in 1919, in common with quite a lot of the other large estates that got broken up after the First World War, this estate was sold and we lost the tenancy of the land. But the blue parts were bought by somebody called Mr. Horsley. And if we move then to the next slide. Next slide, please. We can see here on the left, that is the sale of our agricultural effects. So in 1919, when we lost the tenancy because of the sale, we had to sell off a lot of our agricultural effects. So this is our farm sale in 1920. Luckily, we were farming in other areas as well at that point, so we didn't have to sell absolutely everything. But it's obviously quite a big change for the family. Now, we mentioned engineering. My family also had a foundry that they rented from the Young family, which we actually bought in 1919. So as one door closes, another opens. Now, Mr. Horsley was one of the first barley barons. Later on, we'll be going to look at rotation and its importance in agriculture. What Horsley was doing was growing continuous barley cropping, one barley crop after another. And that has a tendency to degrade the ground because disease builds up and you're mining the same nutrients year after year because each crop takes a different thing. But if you're using the same crop over and over and over again, then you tend to degrade things. So by the time of the Second World War, Manor Farm, Little Harrowden, was in a very poor state, and it was the first farm in Northamptonshire to be repossessed by the War Agricultural Committee because of the import of growing food in for our own food security during the war. And so Horsley got thrown out, and we were able then to take over the farm again, and we bought it coming out of the Second World War. So that catalogue on the right is Mr. Horsley's farm disposal sale from 1940. So we now own that area of blue land, which in more recent years we've separated up into two parts of the family. So my uncle has half of it, we have half of it, and then my father and I also rent some land. So we're now about 200 hectares, of which we own 120, and we rent about 80. So we've got a foot in both camps. We're mostly arable. We have 162 hectares of arable land, 10 hectares of pasture, and then we have environment schemes and woodland. So we're 9 hectares of agri-environment scheme, 7 of woodland, and we maintain on the farm 17 kilometres of hedgerow. If we could move then to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to take you a little bit through the farming year, starting from what we would do after harvest. Immediately the harvest is off, then you start preparing ground for the next year's crop. So what we see in the top left-hand corner there is ploughing, a very traditional method. We've used that for about 4,000 years. And the idea is that you invert the soil, so you can see the residue of the old crop, the yellowy greeny stubble there, and the farmer is driving that plough across the field and inverting the soil, and that gives us an entry for the next crop. And then below it is a machine called a power harrow, which is a rotary tillage machine, and that breaks up those sort of cloddiness in the plough into a nice seed bed to be able to put your next crop in. In more recent times, we've decided to go along a less disruptive method, which is known as minimum tillage. So what you see on the right is at the top a machine called a horse Tirano, which only works at a few inches in the very sort of top surface of the soil. Ploughing, you typically be 8 to 10 inches. On the minimum tillage side, generally no more than 3. And then below that you can see my father using that very machine in the field just round our buildings here. So we weren't pioneers in minimum tillage, but we are early adopters. We've been doing this for 21 years now. We stopped ploughing that time ago, and really we haven't looked back. It did cause us a few problems early on, but now our yields match what we used to be able to achieve with the plough. But we expend a fraction of the diesel, and we don't have anywhere near the amount of wearing material. When you're ploughing, an awful lot of metal gets worn off in the soil. Well, minimum tillage, we don't have anywhere near as much wear. And we can also do the job a lot faster and with less labour. So minimum tillage has been a great thing for us. Anyway, if we move now to the next slide, please. Having prepared our seed bed, we then need to plant the crop for the next year. So you can see there my drill and tractor. That large red hopper on top of the drill is filled up with seed, and then as you progress across the field, the seed is blown down those little yellow tubes and out through the feet in the bottom of the drill, and those feet are cutting a slot in the soil, which then gets covered up and pressed by the rollers at the back. So the seed is nestled nicely in the soil and gets a good contact with the soil and the moisture that's there, and then hopefully, all being well, it starts to grow. And then what you see in the bottom right is the emergence of a crop that's probably about a month old. So we'd be doing this operation typically in October for wheat, and that image at the bottom right is what the wheat now looks like in November, having come out of the ground and grown on for a month. Now, in arable systems, typically we don't have a great deal to do with the crop over winter. There might be some husbandry that is required, but the real work starts in the spring. So if we go to the next slide, please. So here we are in early spring. You can see in the top left that wheat now has spread out. It has grown a little bit over the winter and it's spread out to cover the ground. It's probably double the height, but there'll be considerably more leaf on it, as from what we saw in the November picture earlier. So having got to this stage, we then typically start on fertilization, and you can see that going on the top right there. That fertilizer spreader has got the synthetic fertilizer in it, which is being spread across the field by some rotating discs on the bottom of the machine. And then below that, you can see some crop spraying going on, which is typical of what you call a plant protection product. So if there is disease in the crop, like fungal disease, or we have pests perhaps like aphids which are eating the crop, then you may spray a plant protection product to help mitigate the effects of those problems. Now, there's a lot of precision involved in doing these operations typically, and you can see on the bottom left some of the electronic control system that I have in the fertilizer spreader. The green box actually controls the spreader itself. Then there's an iPad there which is connected to GPS. That is varying the rate of the fertilizer as it goes on across the field. And then there's also a GPS unit below that, which is helping with the steering of the tractor so that I can maintain those straight lines that you can see in the other pictures. And the reason we do this precision application is so that we actually use product where it's most likely to do good. So we can use satellite imagery of the crops in order to determine which parts of the field are growing well and which plants aren't, and then we can apply the fertilizer using that GPS system. In the first instance, maybe a bit more fertilizer where the plants are a bit behind to bring them on, but then ultimately when we get closer to harvest on the final application of fertilizer, if parts of the field are not doing so well, then there's not a lot of point in wasting fertilizer on them. So it's part of our resource efficiency, and you can see this sort of technology moving into most agricultural operations now. So if we move on to the next slide, please. This is some of the other things that are going on at this time of year. It's lambing time, April. So you can see my wife there with a fairly recently born lamb and the sheepdog looking on. And then on the right-hand side, this is a symptom of the tricky weather that we have to deal with these days. I'm fertilizing actually at night, trying to catch a weather window. We tend to find that with climate change being what it is, the windows in which we can do operations are very much compressed. So sometimes we have to run all night in order to get things done when the weather presents an opportunity. And fertilizer is one of those things where a little bit of rain is quite helpful just to wash it in and help the plants grow. An awful lot of rain is a major problem. So we're always looking at the weather forecast to try and get this thing right. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Now we come through to June, having done all our husbandry. Hopefully we have a healthy looking crop like what you see on the left of that picture. This is in the stage of senescence, which is another word for ripening. The little bit that's green in front of us hasn't got quite as far as the bit that's at the back of the picture. But generally through June and July, crops are ripening. This is wheat, so we'll be looking to be harvesting this as a ripe crop in August and perhaps early September. On the right, whilst we're looking at this picture, you'll see a rough grass margin, which is a harbourage for beneficial insects and wildlife, and it also protects the hedge and the watercourse that runs along that hedge from the nutrition, the artificial nutrition that we're putting on that crop, because it means we don't get overlaps of spraying into the hedge. So we have buffer strips like that round all of our fields for that reason and others, which we'll come on to in the sustainability part of this. If we could move then on to the next slide, please. Another thing that's happening in June and early July, shearing of sheep. The wool, as you know, is nice and warm, so we remove it from the sheep's back in order to keep the sheep cool over the summer. You can see the chap in the red in the middle there. He's got a pair of clippers and he's clipping the wool off the sheep. My mother on the left is carrying the wool from the last sheep that was shorn to my father, who is wrapping it on the table there, and then it gets put in a large sack called a wool sack, surprisingly enough, and sent off to a central collection point where British wool then sell it into the market. Now, the unfortunate thing about wool is, although it's an amazing product, essentially in sheep farming, it's a waste product. It's not worth anything. And so we end up losing money usually on shearing. The amount we have to shear, pay the shearers, and the amount that it costs to deliver it to British wool generally outstrips the amount that we will be paid for it. And it's one of the most upsetting things actually in farming, that we do have these amazing sustainable products, but the value placed on them in the marketplace today is very low. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. This is harvesting. So now our wheat has senesced, and we're there with the combine on the top right, and cutting that wheat, and then that wheat gets put from the combine into the tractors and trailers, which you see at the bottom left, and delivered into our corn store and yard here. And then we tip it in the corn store, and you can see a heap of that's roughly 20-foot high heap there. There's on the bottom right, there's roughly 600 tons in that heap, and then on the top left you can see our loading shovel, which is how we then load that wheat out of our store, where in our case it goes into a cooperative central grain store. It might very well go straight to a mill. A lot of our wheat that we grow on this farm goes into Weetabix or Hovis, who both have mills locally, or it may go for export and get delivered to a dock. If we just move to the next slide, please. You'll probably see lorries like this on the road quite regularly, bulker transport. This is one of those days where they all turned up at once in the yard. I had 10 lorries queued round the yard. Each lorry takes about 28 tons. And on our farm of 200 hectares, we're producing, roughly speaking, 1,000 to 1,200 tons of product of various types per year. So we have rather a lot of these lorries to load out during the course of the year. Okay, so that sort of takes us through the farming year as you would see it on a sort of typical arable farm. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll have a look at the sustainability elements of this and why it's important. So as you know, climate change is pretty undisputed these days. I happened to be in a dinner with Tony Juniper the other day, the chairman of Natural England, and he pointed out that there is now more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than there has been at any point in human history. So we are well into uncharted territory. And as farmers, we see this every day. It's pouring with rain today, which I suppose might be typical for November, but as you know, there are storms hitting the UK almost on a weekly basis at the moment, and that is most definitely not typical. And we see the effects of this virtually every day we go out on the farm. As Esther was talking about in her video before this session, there's a great deal of biodiversity loss that has happened since the agricultural revolution. We are degrading our soils because they are overworked. The plough has not done the soil any favours, I'm afraid to say, and neither do synthetic inputs. We see a lot of erosion. We're losing the organic material that is in the soil by disturbing it too much and expecting too much of it. And then we also have erosion, wind erosion and water erosion. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s is sadly not unique. Those events still happen today in America and indeed in the fens in the UK, where soils are not well managed. We also have diminishing resources, and our input costs are going through the roof. So fossil fuels, we know we are running out, but a lot of what we rely on in agricultural inputs are based on fossil fuels. So our nitrogen fertilizer, the Haber-Bosch process, is highly energy intensive and relies on methane gas and energy from other sources to be able to create or to fix the nitrogen artificially. A lot of the actions that we take on the farm use fossil fuels for their energy source, drying of grain and all the tractor work that we do. And then many of the chemicals that we use are also based on the petrochemical industry. We have a situation of reducing efficacy. So our pesticides and herbicides, we find we are seeing resistance to much of what we use. And indeed, there are some things like blackgrass and cabbage stem flea beetle, which are major herbicide and insect pests that we just cannot control anymore with the chemicals that we might traditionally have used. So we're having to find different ways of doing things to work around these problems. And then, of course, there is much pollution that we're seeing in land, air and water, and a good deal of the water pollution does come from agriculture. In fact, the streams immediately around us are poorly rated for certain nutrient issues, and the major reason on that is agriculture, sad to say. Now, there are demands on agriculture. Feed the world is an expression you will often hear in farming circles. It's a slightly difficult one. As an individual farmer, of course, we cannot feed the world, but as a group, that is our job. We have pressures on land, with pressures on resources. There are ever more developments and loss of land, all those problems of above. We have to achieve the same or more as the population of the world grows, but we have less resource with which to do it. And then those problems and demands lead into a response in policy and public expectation. So we're seeing regulatory change, which encourages or forces sustainability practices. Society expects us to do things in a sustainable way increasingly. And then finance and trade is also expecting the same sort of thing. So Nestle, for instance, have a carbon net zero target of by 2050, but we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture later. One of the major things they wish to do is source by, I think, 2030, something like 25% they intend to resource from regenerative agriculture. And by 2050, I think it will be 50%. So you can sort of see that, and then of course the banks are often only releasing finance on the basis of you having done some sort of green action. So it's becoming increasingly important to work in these ways to even be able to trade in the food that we grow. So if we could move then on to the next slide. Now, the question is, how did we get to this situation? Agriculture, by and large, these days takes what you might describe as a reductionist approach. It is the case, and it's a sort of quite an attractive idea that we've been sold for a long time, this principle that if you have a problem, the solution to it can come in this bottle that we can sell you. And it simplifies the way agriculture works. But what we're learning with the problems that we listed on the previous page, and in particular the one about resistance, is that those solutions are running out of steam. Now, this all really started a long time ago in the 18th century with somebody known as Turnip Townsend, who we'll talk about on the next slide. But when increases in agricultural efficiency started to happen in the 18th century, and then we got mechanization building up with Jethro Tull and the seed drill. That developed at a fairly slow pace until the Victorian era, when there were huge advantages in agricultural technology, things like thrashing drums and harvesting equipment and improved ploughs. And then, as Esther mentioned, with the Second World War, food security became a major issue, and that drove the acceleration in mechanization and really pushed a lot of these techniques and artificial inputs and some of the original arable and agricultural chemicals and techniques for using them were developed coming out of the Second World War. What that all meant is that with these relatively high inputs, we could achieve really quite incredible high outputs, and yields just went through the roof through the next few decades. Of course, all this is driven by the abundant fossil fuels that we have had available, and tractors came about early part of the 20th century, really 1917 through to 1930, the establishment of the modern tractor, and that having abundant fossil fuel, the power to employ it, meant that we could work the soils deeper and deeper. And for a while, as I say, for decades, in fact, that enabled us to increase the output of our farms. But really, over the last couple of decades, those yields have now plateaued, and that system has been running out of steam. The attraction of this reductionist approach is simplification. It has allowed us to have lazy crop rotations and easy chemical and pest control. And as I say, there's no criticism here. It's a very attractive thing. It's easy to manage because you know that if you've got a problem, you can go out and spray it with something. Artificial nutrition has limited our need for restorative phases in the arable rotation. So that was something that Turnip Townsend introduced to the country, and we just don't need to do that anymore. We can plaster some fertilizer on it, and the plants will hopefully grow. Then commercial demands. These days, product specifications are very high. There are contractual obligations to meet yields and the form of certain products like apples or potatoes. Supermarkets want them to look nice, and those are all things that it's easy to achieve with this sort of approach, much less easy to achieve if you let nature just take its course. And then, of course, we have the big business vested interests. If you're Syngenta or Monsanto, then you really want to sell me as a farmer some product that's going to make you a lot of money. And so we've been encouraged by business to go down these lines, but that has resulted in a sort of treadmill effect where many of our businesses are stuck with putting these inputs in, and it's very difficult to step off it because farming doesn't yield a great deal of profit. And if you step outside the thing that you have been done and has so far been fairly reliable, there is a huge risk involved. And so it's very difficult just to get off that treadmill. Now, next slide, please. So we mentioned Charles Turnip Townsend. He was the second Viscount Townsend, an agriculturalist. He adapted the system of rotation that was developed in Vaasland in what's now northern Belgium, where one crop benefits the following crop. So it's known as the Norfolk four-course rotation, and the way it was done here was turnips, which could be grazed by cattle. And the cattle then are fertilizing the ground. And then after the other thing that turnips do is they condition the soil, so they sort of break up compaction, they improve drainage, as well as those other, just the simple fact of giving feed to the cattle, and then the cattle are food for us. So that then gives a good entry to barley, which benefits from the nutrition and the good soil conditions. Then after clover, we go into another restorative phase. Sorry, after barley, we go into another restorative phase of clover. Clover is nitrogen fixing, so that takes nitrogen from the air and puts it into the soil, and that then makes the soil more nutritious for growing a good crop of wheat afterwards. And then, having grown our wheat, we go back into the turnips to repeat the process. Now, this business of exploitative and then restorative phases is the foundational principle of modern organic farming. So you might ask, well, if we've known about this for so long, and this clearly doesn't require a great deal of synthetic input, why couldn't we just go organic? Well, there's a few potential issues. Organic, one, it's highly regulated, so it's certified, and that means that there are limited tools in the box. You cannot put synthetic inputs of any sort on organic. That doesn't mean you can't use inputs full stop. There are a range of natural inputs that can be put on, things like lime or polysulfate, which is a rock product and can be used as a fertilizer. You can put farmyard manure on. There are certain chemicals like ferric phosphate which can be used for killing slugs. But generally speaking, there are quite a limited number of tools in the box. It's reliant on tillage generally, so ploughing and inter-row hoeing to pull weeds up, and that tillage is also generally reliant on fossil fuels at the moment. So that may be an issue that comes, or the organic system comes to face. And there is a yield penalty. By going organic, you would typically yield something like half what we would in a more intensive agricultural system. So there's an alternative approach that is gathering steam: regenerative agriculture. Now, this works on a set of 5 or 6 principles, which we'll come to on the next slide, rather than rules and codification like organic does. And the aim of regenerative agriculture is to rebuild the resource base upon which it relies. And it's a broad church. Nothing is ruled out, but there are some things that the principles define, which is what we're aiming for in this approach. Now, organic and regenerative are systems approaches to agriculture, and really that's what the Norfolk four-course rotation is. It's a recognition that each system has an influence on the other, and you're looking very carefully at the interactions of those systems. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So these are the 5 main principles of regenerative agriculture. Biological diversity. There is something known as the Darwin effect, where having a diverse polyculture, it proves to be more successful than just having monocultures. So we aim to have diverse rotations of crops, and then in between them grow diverse stands of cover crops, which help to achieve the other things that are there as principles. So one of them, maintain living roots in the ground. The advantage of having living roots there is that they help to structure the soil. They help to stabilize it so it's less prone to erosion. And they feed the soil microbiology, which in turn has a symbiotic relationship with the plants and feeds the plants back. So the roots are pumping carbohydrate and carbon into the soil all the time. And that is what feeds the microbes in the root rhizosphere. And then the microbes in that rhizosphere are converting nutrients in the soil into something that the plants can use. Third principle is to protect the soil, or soil armor as it's sometimes known. Again, that's protecting from erosion. It's protecting from the loss of moisture. and it is helping to build organic matter in the soil. And then reducing disturbance. By disturbing soil, we tend to burn off all of those things that we've been building up. So our soil organic matter and our roots and our microbiology, if we plough, you get a great plume of carbon dioxide, which is a loss of those things from your soil. You also upset things like worms and so on, which are essential for looking after the soil health. And moving on to the last one there, integration of organic material by grazing sheep and cattle on our ground, then we can also accelerate the amount of sequestration of carbon and nutrients back into the soil. So all these things build up as a system. If we move on to the next slide, I'm just going to talk very quickly about integrated pest management. Rather than chemical control, we can look at good agronomic practices, so doing things like the rotations we were talking about, using resistant varieties. So instead of growing a variety that is prone to a fungal disease, there are certain ones that are resistant. Good machinery hygiene, those sort of things prevent pests and difficulties being spread around the farm. Then moving up our pyramid, we would look at decision support, so monitoring our problems, and then deciding whether an intervention is really required, rather than just going out and putting some fertilizer on or using a chemical. And then there are certain mechanical controls and natural controls. You can see on the left there some hoverflies, which are a beneficial insect, and they a single hoverfly larvae can consume 1,200 aphids. So if we have an abundance of hoverflies and we have an aphid problem in our crop, then rather than spraying it with an aphicide, we can let the hoverfly larvae do the work for us. And there are ladybirds which do similar things, carabid beetles, parasitic wasps, and then of course they also help pollinate. So there are ways we can do these things sustainably without having to resort to chemical control. But because we're regenerative and not organic, we still have that tool in the box to use if we need to. If we could just move on to the next slide. This is a cover crop. So we have a diverse cover crop here on the left. There's a whole different bunch of species in there. You can see the sunflowers, there's phacelia, there's radishes, there's oats, there's vetches, there's clover, and all those things are doing different services for our soil. And then on the right, you can see me putting some electric fence out. So if we go to the next slide, we can actually graze that cover crop as well as a way of destroying it instead of having to use chemicals. So the sheep are returning that nutrition then to the ground. We've used the cover crop for conditioning the soil, so we can cut out some of our cultivation effort, and then use the sheep for returning the nutrition to the soil, rather than having to spray that cover crop off. Then if we go to the next slide, this is a before and after of grazing, so you can see the sheep in a fairly fresh cover crop there, and then on the right, that is them having grazed it. But you can also see that there's the soil organic matter that's going in there, all that material. We've protected the soil from sunlight and erosion because we've got that organic material still on the top. So these things are building into our regenerative agriculture picture. Now if we move on to the next slides. This is another one of the buffer strips. You can see it's floristically enhanced. So what we're doing here is providing an alternative habitat for those beneficial insects whilst the middle of the field is growing up. Obviously, if you cultivate the field and plant a crop there, it's no good if there's nowhere for the insects and the beneficials to reside in between times. And you also see the diverse sort of hedgerow that we've got, which is a good habitat for all sorts of other beneficial things, and not least a lot of rare birds like that kind of alternative types of hedging. I'm conscious we're getting short on time, so we'll move quickly on to the next 2 slides, please. We go on to the next one. This is an in-field cover strip. So we've put this grass strip through the middle of a fairly large field here in order to provide landscape connectivity, because a lot of these beneficials, they will only travel into the field 50 or so meters. So we've separated up this large field by these strips to allow a corridor for those beneficials to move right through the field. I'd just like to go to the very last slide, if we could, please. We'll quickly do this one. So I think, as I said, there's a lot in this. The potential, pollution reduction, carbon sequestration, higher quality food and nutrient density. We can make more efficient use of our resources by regenerative farming, and as you've seen, there's an opportunity for recovering nature and biodiversity, all built within this system. And what we have on the right here is a fantastic example. This is agroforestry, so there's a combination of things going on there, but you can see from the picture how beneficial that will be to the environment, as well as providing different sources of income over and above just the arable. Last slide, please. I think there should be one more slide, please. That's it. So some things I'd like you to think about from a project management point of view, and that we have to consider in farming. It is an intergenerational business, so what we're talking about, what the things that we plan usually have an element of legacy in them. And I believe that needs to be a consideration in all projects. And planning, therefore, for the medium and long term and product life cycles is very important. We have to invest wisely, and we have to avoid waste in time, effort, money and resources. And then a principle that really has come to the fore is in the last few years is that you can't be green if you're in the red. As farmers, we have to make sure that our businesses are robust in the short term, because every day we go out, with climate change being what it is, our factory floor changes virtually every day or every week we go out on the farm. But that doesn't mean that we abandon the sustainability efforts in terms of that short-term gain. But what it does mean is that we have to be very careful about how we plan things in order to negotiate those short-term weather issues whilst looking to be sustainable in the medium to long term. And from a personal point of view, I'd encourage everybody to be engaged, considerate and responsible. Know where you get your food from, engage with some farmers and producers of it. If you can buy locally from smaller suppliers, then please do. Seasonal produce, reducing food miles will make a big difference, and of course, minimizing waste. So I'm sorry we haven't been able to get into a huge amount of detail on everything. I'm sure there are some questions, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Henry, thank you. That was great. I was fascinated by everything you were saying there, and we've got a few questions here. So Vikas asks, he references Jeremy Clarkson's program about farming and how he's shown us how expensive and difficult it can be to run a profitable farm. And he asks, are there things, how can we assist you and other farmers in becoming profitable? Are there programs or plans in place to support new farmers, or even to drive new people to take up farming?
Well, it's a very good question, and it is quite a challenge. I didn't get to say it earlier, but one of the biggest problems with farming is financing the operation. So land is expensive for starters. The profit levels are very low. And the other problem is that you need a lot of money in order to be able to buy all the inputs that you have, and you have to be able to sustain that for a year before you get any return on it. So from the moment you start planting to the moment you harvest, it's all expenditure. And most farms run very, very large overdrafts. I would say typically 5 to 10 times what their profit will be could be your overdraft or loan account. Now, and then sometimes that return even doesn't come, in our case, because we're through a central grain store, the return doesn't come for another year to 18 months. So we're now 2 years from our original investment before we get any money back. And that is a major challenge. So I think there are something that would be very beneficial is good access to finance that doesn't perhaps have too many conditions on green, and I know sustainability is a theme of this thing, but if you actually want farmers to be farming, then by putting up a whole load more barriers is probably detrimental. There have been some government schemes aimed at getting new entrants into farming. I think realistically, people coming into farming will probably have to rent land because the price of land is so high. Gone are the days, as they were in my grandfather's time, when it was possible for a 21-year-old to go out and borrow what would now have to be the equivalent of 1 or 2 million quid to buy a fairly small farm. It just, the price of land is too far out of kilter with its productive capability to be able to do that. So I think new entrants to farming need to be encouraged through engagement with schools, enthusiasm, and the sort of thing that we're doing here, and encouraging people to come and work on farms, and then hopefully that opens the door to them to rent land. But I'm afraid I think the days of starting out and hoping to be an owner of land are somewhat behind us.
Thank you. Good. The other question that Vikas asks is about ultra processed foods, which of course have been very much in the news recently, and he wonders how they are affecting farming, and how we could inform people about what they should and shouldn't do to support farming and the lower prices that are associated with processing food.
Well, I think as farmers, we generally speaking, we don't have a great deal of influence on what happens downstream in the food system. So I think in many ways it goes back to my point about buying local where you can. If you're able to support your local greengrocer, then generally speaking, they will not be selling a highly processed food. It becomes difficult when you are buying things from supermarkets, where there is obviously a lot more processing and packaging that will go on in some of that stuff. It's difficult to say exactly how highly processed food affects farmers. I think essentially, you see, we're selling a commodity product by and large, so it's the market price is set. We have very little control over it unless you're in the business of producing your own food boxes or sort of meat boxes and that kind of thing. Then there's not much influence we can have on that. Sad to say. So I would just encourage you, where you can, to support people who are taking those initiatives. But as for sort of commodities, the sort of that 1,200 tons of output that we produce, once it's gone off the farm, there's very little influence that we have in the future of it. But there's also very little influence we can have on the price of it, because it is set by a world market. Yes, I'm not sure whether that answers your question particularly well.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I had a question really, which was about this question of engaging directly with consumers. You know, in a very middle class way, we have a Riverford box that comes every week, which is great, and the opportunity. I wondered about the opportunities for farmers to involve people either through selling directly through box schemes or through some of the work that you do in bringing people onto the farm and actually connecting people more with your farm.
Well, I think it's vital for our future. For one thing, I'm very keen about, as you say, getting people coming onto the farm and seeing what we do, and an understanding of where the food comes from is, I mean, it just seems fundamentally important, because we all rely on being able to go out and buy this stuff. So why wouldn't you be interested in it? I think it's vital for encouraging the next generation of people to come into the farm. And I mean, we've got a young lad who started with us this week coming here because he's interested in farming. And I think that's absolutely tremendous to see that ambition and excitement in it. People like Riverford have done a great thing by making that sort of, essentially, it's kind of a local produce, but it's available to on a much wider scale. And I think that is really a sort of positive development. But we can't all do that. If you go back to the business of feeding the world is fed by commodity food products, wheat and barley and beans and those sorts of cereals and oil seeds that we grow are fundamentally commodity things, but they are our staples. And it's unlikely that you're going to be going to Riverford for a bag of wheat to mill at home and make some bread out of. But support your local baker would be a better idea.
Excellent. And I think Eula wanted to launch a Mentimeter poll so that you can give Henry some feedback on what you've heard. So Eula, if you want to do that, I don't know if there's anything else you want to launch before the next session. I think we've got a break for lunch, but if not, I'll continue asking questions of Henry. And I had a particular question, which is, you're an engineer as well as a farmer. And you did allude to this in one of your slides, but I wondered what you think projects and engineers can take from farming. You know, what have you learned as a farmer that you bring when you come to an engineering project?
Well, one of the aspects of my job is that it covers a very broad range of disciplines. So we were talking earlier that I might be doing some agricultural engineering one day, another day it could be involving superconducting magnets. And I don't have an expertise in all of those things, but some of the stuff that you learn from farming about this sort of systems approach is a directly applicable thing. And understanding the interactions of the interfaces between different systems is how I am able to do my engineering. But I think the other thing that I take away from farming is that sort of that intergenerational element of it, that we're doing stuff for legacy and the medium to long term. And I hate seeing waste. I hate seeing things that are designed to be to work for a sort of limited period and sort of have an obsolescence built in. I'm afraid to say that I think the time for obsolescence is gone. We need to be designing, managing projects for the long term, because we can't afford to waste anything anymore. We've been through that period of our history, and the abundance of materials and energy, I think we're seeing it come to an end. So that's what I try to do, is transfer those principles into what we design and make in engineering, make sure it's going to last and be useful for the long term.
Yeah. I have another question. Sorry. I have another question from Gordon, who, technical question. He asked, does a cover crop mean that you do not need to use fertilizers on the field?
Well, it could do. So we ran a test a couple of years ago where we actually had a slightly longer term lay, as you would call it. So it was a legume rich lay. It had grass in it and a lot of legumes. Now we planted that up then subsequently with wheat and ran a trial along one of our tram lines where we put no fertilizer on it at all. And the yield on that tram line compared to its adjacent tram line were within a sort of statistically insignificant amount of each other. So the basic answer is yes, you can do it, and that is how the organic system works. It would typically have a couple of years of a lay with a heavy amount of legumes in it, and that's how they build up their soil fertility. And that's why they don't then need to put fertilizer on in the next stages of the rotation. So yes, it can be done. It's a case of how you choose the plants that are in your cover crop and what your actual cover crop aims are, because those plants can do all sorts of different things, but nutrient fixing is one of them. There's an issue of product specification, though, that we go back to. If you're growing milling wheat, it has to reach a certain protein amount in order to be acceptable at a mill. I think it's about 13% protein. Now, if you haven't put enough nitrogen fertilizer on, the likelihood is you're not going to hit that rating. So if we're going to move along this system of using plants for our restorative phases and getting rid of artificial fertilizer, then those sorts of specifications need to be varied. But of course, then you get into a business of, well, now the Chorley wood process doesn't work anymore for making our bread. So it's vastly complicated. It's kind of, if you'll excuse the pun, it's baked into the system to an extent. It's quite, there are challenges all the way along with this.
Yeah. We just have, I think, 2 minutes left. And so I was going to ask you a kind of aspirational question is, if economics and tech allowing, what would you like to do? If there were no constraints, what would you do?
Well, what I would like to do, our sort of immediate aspiration, I suppose, and it really goes to where we want to be in a few years' time, is we're minimum tillage now, and we want to be no-till. I really want to be no-till and organic, if I could. I'm not sure I should tell my father that. He'd be a bit worried. But no-till organic is kind of the panacea. But as we mentioned earlier, organic relies on tillage for its weed control. And I think there may be a way. There's certainly a way probably in America where they get heavy frosts and so on in places, and you can use that as part of your weed control. But my aspiration is to really move away from any chemical control at all and to no-till. I suspect we may have to maintain an element of chemical control for certain herbs, sort of herbicide type things, but I think we can get most of the way there. And that's really where I see our direction of travel. And by utilizing things like composts and cover crops, I hope that we can strip out almost all of our artificial nutrition as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I appreciate that a lot of what you do is a process rather than a project when you're on a farm. But I think it's interesting to hear the way that you experiment, in the way that we encourage people to experiment in projects to learn. And it's clearly, the knowledge, the combined knowledge that your father has, that you have, and that you continue to generate are such a fundamental part of your work. And as a knowledge manager, I think I think we could take something from that. That knowledge and that learning from what you're doing is fundamental.
Well, the most interesting thing about regenerative agriculture is that if you talk about it to my grandfather, who is 92, he says, well, that's how I used to do it.
Of course.
And there's nothing new here. I mean, we're going back to Turnip Townsend and the 18th century. We're just relearning the lessons.
Yes. I mean, I guess your grandfather was in the early days of mechanization, so he would have been using horses and he really using equipment, but he wouldn't have been using tractors.
That's right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, I think it's 12:15, so I think we're done, Henry. That was a that was great. I really enjoyed that, and I hope everybody else on the call, I'm sure they did. There's some great comments in the chat from people who've obviously enjoyed it. So thank you ever so much.
Super. Thank you.